Some weapons aren't drawn with anger, they're drawn with fear. Harrison Ford hadn't worn a uniform in over a decade, but one quiet afternoon in Crescent Ridge Park, a young officer approached his window, hand trembling near his holster. What happened next didn't just shake the badge, it shook the system. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe. The late afternoon light stretched like soft fire through the trees of Crescent Ridge Park. Shadows lengthened across the ground in quiet procession as the wind stirred the surface of the lake into slow-moving ripples. The world here moved gently, like it had forgotten to rush. Park benches stood empty, ducks floated in loose formation, and tucked against the far edge of the grass, just beyond the walking path, sat a faded green Ford Bronco, still, silent, and humming faintly. Inside, Harrison Ford sat behind the wheel. His hands, calloused from decades of work and flight and life, cupped a small ceramic mug. Steam rose from the tea like a whisper, catching the dying sunlight as it curled upward and vanished. The window was half down. The air smelled of pine and cut grass and something older, like time passing slowly. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes, worn yet sharp, were fixed on the lake, but they weren't really watching it. They were remembering. 15 years ago, Harrison had landed here, right in that clearing across the water, in a chopper with one rotor half dead and a 6-year-old girl in the back, whose life had been hanging by threads of breath. No one remembered that anymore. The girl lived. The news moved on. The chopper was scrapped. But Harrison, he never forgot. He didn't return for attention. He returned because this was the last day that squadron even existed. The Air Rescue Unit was officially dissolved at noon. He was the last of them still alive. That knowledge sat with him quietly, like the wind, like the lake. He didn't need memorials or speeches. He needed one more minute alone, right here, where the past still echoed if you listened hard enough. In the distance, a few teenagers tossed a football. A mother pushed a stroller. No one gave the Bronco a second glance. And that was how he wanted it. Harrison Ford wasn't there to be seen. He was there to feel what it meant to be forgotten by everyone but yourself. He took a sip of tea. It burned just a little, the way he liked it. In the passenger seat lay a folded flight map, creased, worn, edges softened from years of use. There were initials written in ink across the bottom. 6 names, 5 were crossed out. Harrison's was not yet. He exhaled through his nose and watched the ducks drift across the surface. They didn't know anything about medals or missions or the weight a uniform could carry long after you took it off. Somewhere in the quiet, a squirrel darted up a tree. A wind chime from a house nearby rang faintly. Harrison closed his eyes for a moment and let it all happen. Let the silence be enough. Let the world forget his name while he remembered theirs. But silence has a strange way of drawing noise. And on this particular afternoon, with the lake calm and the sky golden, something was already moving at the edge of it. Something that didn't yet know who sat inside that Bronco. Something that believed it had the right to interrupt peace. And Harrison, he didn't move, he didn't turn his head, he just took another sip and waited. Across the park, behind the tinted windshield of a standard-issue cruiser, Officer Kyle Mercer sat tapping his fingers against the steering wheel. 29 years old, fresh out of the academy 2 years ago, promoted too early, some whispered. Too eager, others said. His eyes, restless behind mirrored sunglasses, scanned the tree line, the benches, the parked cars. He wasn't looking for trouble, he was expecting it. Last week, he'd been written up for hesitating. A report came in, disturbance near a pharmacy. Mercer had arrived, scanned the scene, and waited. The suspect was gone by the time backup arrived. His superior didn't mince words. You froze. You waited for perfect information and missed the call. You don't get to wait, you act. That sentence had burned in him ever since. Now every parked vehicle was a potential threat, every still figure a possible danger. The idea of letting something slip again clawed at his pride like a slow burn. Through the passenger side window, his gaze landed on the old green Bronco across the field, half shaded beneath the trees. Engine on, windows down. Driver unmoving, no music, no phone, just stillness. Something about it set off a quiet alarm in his head, Most people idled to check messages or eat. This one wasn't eating, wasn't moving. Just sitting there, like he belonged in a painting no one signed. Mercer reached for the small binoculars he kept tucked between the seats, adjusted focus. The man inside was older, face angled slightly toward the lake. He couldn't make out much, just graying hair and a stillness that somehow irritated him. People didn't just sit anymore, not without purpose, not without hiding something. He keyed the mic. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12. Got a vehicle parked off the north edge of Crescent Ridge. Engines running. Driver appears unresponsive. Could be a stakeout. I'm gonna check it out." He didn't wait for acknowledgement. He didn't ask for a second opinion. He clicked off the radio, threw the car into gear, and crossed the grass divider onto the paved park access lane. In his mind, Mercer was already framing the situation. Suspicious male, parked alone, possible surveillance, possible impaired, possible evasion. His training kicked in like muscle memory, but what really moved him wasn't policy. It was fear, not of the man in the truck, but of repeating last week. Of watching and waiting and being told again he wasn't ready, that he didn't act, that he wasn't enough. As the cruiser crept forward, his posture straightened. The mirror-polished badge caught a slant of sun. His right hand hovered near his belt, not touching, just close enough to feel ready. The Bronco didn't move. The driver didn't turn. Mercer's jaw tightened. There was no threat, not yet, but Mercer didn't see an old man sipping tea. He saw a non-compliant subject, someone who hadn't waved, hadn't looked, hadn't reacted. That to him was defiance, and in the absence of certainty, he defaulted to control. He stopped the car a few feet behind the Bronco, engine idling, took one slow breath, then opened the door and stepped out. The sun bounced off his glasses. His boots met the pavement with clipped precision. He walked forward, measured, deliberate, with the kind of authority that came not from confidence, but from needing to prove you had it. Inside the Bronco, Harrison Ford didn't move. He saw the patrol car in his mirror, saw the officer, saw the body language, and without so much as a shift in his seat, he knew it was about to begin. Again, only this time, the lesson wouldn't be his to learn. Officer Mercer approached the Bronco like it might bite. His steps were sharp, his shoulders squared, his right hand hovering just close enough to his sidearm to make sure anyone watching understood who had control. The summer air around him was still, but the silence wasn't peaceful, it was heavy. Behind the glass, Harrison Ford didn't move. The engine was off now. The window was half down. His hands rested calmly on the wheel, fingers relaxed, eyes still on the lake like none of this mattered. Mercer stopped at the driver's window. Sunlight gleamed off his belt buckle as he rapped his knuckles twice against the doorframe. The sound cracked through the air like a warning. Harrison turned his head slowly. No surprise, no smile, just a glance, steady and unreadable. "Roll the window all the way down, sir," Mercer barked. Harrison reached for the switch. The soft whir of glass sliding down was the only sound between them. License and registration. Still no sudden movements, still no panic. Harrison didn't reach for anything. He simply looked at the officer and said evenly, "I don't believe I've broken any laws." Mercer's jaw tightened. "You're parked with the engine running, in a public park. Could be loitering, could be casing the area. Could be something worse. You're not responding to an officer's directive. I need ID." Harrison's voice remained calm. "You're escalating something that hasn't even begun." Mercer took a half step closer. "Do you have a weapon in the vehicle?" "I have the right to," Harrison said, "but I haven't reached for one, haven't moved, haven't made you unsafe in any way." Mercer leaned forward, breathing heavier now. "Name?" Harrison said nothing. "Name, sir, now." And then Harrison spoke, not loud, not confrontational, just quiet, even, like he was speaking to something deeper than the badge. "Are you worried about who I am, or about something you haven't figured out inside yourself?" That one sentence cracked something in Mercer's composure. He flinched, and then he snapped. Hand flying to the holster, he unlatched the safety, drew the weapon, and leveled it directly at Harrison's face. "Out of the vehicle. Now." "Hands where I can see them." The moment froze. Children on the grass nearby stopped running. A woman pushing a stroller gasped. A jogger slowed to a crawl, eyes wide. Several phones went up instantly, filming, live streaming, capturing every second in shaky hands and stunned silence. But Harrison didn't move. He looked down the barrel, a breath away from his face, with the stillness of a man who had stared death down before and never blinked. Mercer's hands were trembling, just slightly, but enough. "You don't know who I am," Harrison said, still not moving. "I don't care who you are," Mercer snapped. "You're a potential threat. You didn't comply." "No," Harrison said softly, "I just didn't play your script." The tension snapped tighter than rope in a storm. From the path nearby, a voice cut through the silence. A cracked, older voice full of disbelief and memory. "Wait, oh my God, is that him?" A man in his 70s stepped closer, pointing at the Bronco, voice rising with every syllable. "That, S. Harrison Ford, that's the guy. He saved my daughter from that fire near Yosemite. Helicopter rescue, 2008, you're pointing a gun at a damn hero." More murmurs from the growing crowd. "Wait, what? Is that really him?" Mercer did lower the gun, but his arms faltered. And behind him, the cameras were rolling, the public watching. Harrison finally looked away from the weapon, meeting Mercer's eyes for the first time. "You don't get to aim fear at someone just because you're feeling it," he said. "Not today." And still he didn't move, because sometimes not moving is the loudest thing a man can do. The phones were up now, everywhere, shaking in hands, faces lit by the screen's glow even in daylight. Some whispered, some stood frozen. Others just filmed, holding their breath as the scene unfolded in real time. Officer Mercer still had the gun raised, but his grip was cracking. His arms were tense, locked by training, but his mind wasn't following anymore. It was slipping, like a script being blown away by wind. Harrison Ford still hadn't moved, not his shoulders, not his hands, not his voice. The man sitting in the Bronco wasn't just calm, he was a monument. He stared ahead, eyes level, mouth closed, like the chaos outside had no claim on his breath. He didn't flinch, he didn't plead. He just waited, like he had waited through firestorms and engine failures and the long silence after final goodbyes. Then slowly, with a movement so deliberate it barely stirred the air, Harrison reached toward the center console. Mercer's breath hitched. The gun wavered, but Harrison didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't reach for a wallet. He pulled out a silver badge, not standard issue, not plastic or plated or decorative. This one was old, etched, worn by years and sunlight. It caught the light and flared just enough for the nearest cameras to catch the inscription. National Search and Rescue Council, Unit Commander, Flight 729, and beneath that, a signature, one that had belonged to a president who no longer lived. Harrison didn't say a word. He just held it, fingers curled gently around its edges, letting the world read what they needed to. His silence did more than shouting ever could. A woman holding her phone gasped, her voice breaking into the crowd. "Oh my God. That's the man who flew into the Sierra fires in '08. That's him. He pulled 3 kids out of a downed plane. You pointed a gun at someone who risked his life while the sky was falling." Someone else chimed in. "You aimed at Harrison Ford. Are you insane?" The shift was immediate, invisible at first, then loud. The crowd, which had once watched in caution, turned, eyes no longer on Harrison, but on Mercer, on the badge on his chest, on the gun still in his hand. Their silence wasn't stunned anymore. It was judgmental, weighty, crushing. Mercer blinked. His lips parted like he wanted to say something, an order maybe, or a denial, but nothing came out. His hands trembled now, no longer from adrenaline but from recognition. He looked at the badge in Harrison's hand, then at the man behind it. Not just a name, not just a face, a record, a legacy. The weight of it settled on him like cold iron. Harrison lowered the silver badge slowly and placed it on the dashboard, still not a word. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't demanding apology. He was letting the moment judge itself. Behind Mercer, someone had called the station. You could hear sirens, faint in the distance, moving fast. Another officer was on the way, maybe a supervisor, maybe more, but none of that mattered in this second. Mercer stood in full view of the crowd, gun in hand, authority evaporating by the second. No one shouted. No one ran. They didn't need to, because the story had already changed. This was no longer a stop. No longer a question of suspicion. It was a mistake. A reckless, irreversible mistake made in full view of a world that would not look away. And in the center of it, Harrison Ford didn't glare. He didn't accuse. He didn't even sigh. He simply looked ahead, like he had seen this before. Like he knew this wasn't about him. It was about what happened when fear got louder than reason, and when silence finally decided to answer back. By nightfall, the video had spread like wildfire. What began as shaky phone footage from a quiet park in Crescent Ridge was now the lead story on every platform with a signal. News anchors leaned into their cameras. Influencers reposted with commentary. Former firefighters, veterans, pilots, and quiet neighbors alike filled the comment sections, some with disbelief, some with rage, but most with a shared sense of something more than a moment gone wrong. It felt personal. The clip was less than 3 minutes long, but it said everything: a uniformed officer, a drawn gun, a parked Bronco, and a man who didn't move, didn't speak, didn't fight, yet somehow stood taller than the whole damn system. By morning, the numbers were climbing fast. 3 million views in 24 hours, trending in 12 states. Hashtag He Aimed at Ford sat at number 2 nationwide, just behind the latest election scandal. But this wasn't politics. This wasn't celebrity. It was something rawer, something deeper. People weren't sharing because it was viral. They were sharing because it felt like justice had been put on trial and nearly got shot in the face. One viral tweet read, "Harrison Ford saved people from wildfires and falling planes." Yesterday, someone aimed a weapon at him for drinking tea near a lake, and we're supposed to call that protocol. A famous director shared the video with a single caption: "He spent his life pulling others out of danger." Yesterday, someone pulled a gun on him, and we're not supposed to be okay with that. The pressure came quickly. A city council meeting was interrupted by protesters holding screenshots from the clip. A national talk show opened with the host tearing up. One guest said quietly, "That officer didn't just misjudge a man, he misjudged an era." We don't tolerate silence anymore, not when it's used to justify fear. Veteran groups issued open letters. Rescue associations reposted images from Harrison's past, rescue missions, training cadets, receiving citations, shaking hands with presidents and children alike. Not because he was famous, but because he had always refused to make noise about what he'd done. Now they made the noise for him. Meanwhile, Harrison Ford said nothing, no press release, no media appearance, no tweet, just silence. Until late that evening, when a simple scan letter appeared on his official website. No logo, no statement from a publicist, just his handwriting on plain paper. It read, "Silence is not surrender." It's the sound systems make when they're forced to look at themselves. I'm not asking for apologies. I'm not here for headlines. But if someone with no name, no camera, and no second chance had been sitting in that seat, I wonder if anyone would have asked why the gun was drawn at all. It ended without a signature. It didn't need one. The quote was shared thousands of times within hours. Civil rights organizations picked it up. City officials reposted it with somber captions. Even some in law enforcement nodded silently and reshared it without comment. And in coffee shops, barber chairs, classrooms, and living rooms across the country, people kept watching that video, watching the stillness, watching the moment where a man of discipline held the line not with anger, but with presence. They didn't just see Harrison Ford, they saw what he stood for, and they didn't see an old actor. They saw the last quiet person who didn't flinch when authority did. The room was quiet, not the kind of quiet that comes from respect, but the kind that arrives after too much attention, too many headlines, and the undeniable truth that the outside world was now watching from every angle. The blinds were drawn, the air conditioning hummed like a nervous breath. Inside the conference room of the Central Precinct, 4 people sat at the long wooden table: the police chief, his deputy, a legal advisor, and Harrison Ford. He didn't sit at the head. He didn't bring an attorney. He didn't ask for coffee. He simply sat near the window, one leg crossed over the other, eyes scanning the training yard below. 2 young cadets were jogging laps in silence. A third trailed behind, slower, unsure. Ford said nothing about them, but he noticed. The chief cleared his throat. "Mr. Ford, first, thank you for coming. I know you didn't have to." Ford didn't respond. The deputy leaned forward, a tablet in front of him filled with policy documents. We've reviewed the footage extensively. The officer in question, Mercer, is on unpaid leave. There's an internal investigation underway. Disciplinary panels are scheduled, and we're looking at updates to the escalation policy. Ford's eyes didn't leave the window. One of the cadets had stopped to tie his shoe. The others kept running. The gap widened. A silence settled in the room. The legal advisor finally spoke. With respect, Mr. Ford, there's pressure on us to act quickly, but we cannot rewrite an entire training protocol over one incident, one mistake. Ford turned his head slowly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean in. He just looked at the man and said, "If you wait until someone without a name is the one who gets the barrel, you'll be rewriting your protocols through tears, not meetings." The room fell still. He continued, "You think this is about me? It's not. It's about the moment a uniform stopped being about protection and started becoming a license for panic. That's not policy, that's rot. And you don't fix rot by painting over it." The chief rubbed his temple. "We understand the severity. That's why we're proposing a new training module on de-escalation, mandatory for all active duty officers. It will include scenario-based drills, response psychology, and call it what you want," Ford said, cutting in, "but make sure it includes the part no one teaches, which is," he looked directly at the chief, "the moment before the gun leaves the holster, the moment where fear pretends to be instinct. You can teach technique, but you need to drill restraint, drill it until it's second nature, until hesitation isn't weakness, but wisdom." There was a long pause. Outside the window, the slow cadet had stopped running altogether. He stood, hands on knees, catching his breath while the others kept moving. Ford watched him for a second, then looked back at the room. The chief sat forward again, quieter now. "What would you call this module if you had a say?" Ford shook his head. "I don't care what name you give it. Ford Protocol, calm command, doesn't matter. Just make sure it teaches them to wait 3 seconds before pulling a weapon. 3 seconds. That's the difference between a resignation letter and a funeral." He stood, the chair legs scraping lightly against the tile. Meeting over. The others rose almost automatically. The deputy opened his mouth, unsure of what to say. Ford didn't wait for thanks. He didn't offer final words. He simply turned, walked toward the exit, and paused at the door. "And one more thing," he said, without turning around. "The camera is what made that moment wrong. The silence afterward did. Then he left. And in that room, for a few seconds more, no one said a thing. They didn't need to. Because the system had just been spoken to by someone it couldn't ignore. Not because of his name, but because of the weight behind it. A week passed. The noise faded. Headlines shifted. But somewhere just outside the blur of news cycles and comment threads, Crescent Ridge Park remained exactly as it had been. The trees stood tall, unmoved by attention. The lake reflected sky and silence in equal parts. And tucked once again near the water's edge, the same green Ford Bronco sat humming faintly beneath a patch of filtered sunlight. Inside, Harrison Ford sat with his usual calm. One hand rested on the steering wheel. The other held a fresh cup of tea, steam rising slowly like it had the first time. The wind moved gently through the open window, carrying the scent of pine and cut grass. A child laughed somewhere far off. Ducks floated. Joggers passed in steady rhythm. No one stared, no one pointed. And he preferred it that way. He wasn't there for recognition. He was there because the silence meant something now, because it had changed. He watched the surface of the water ripple as a breeze shifted the light. He breathed in, not deep, not dramatic. Just enough to feel the weight leave his shoulders in small pieces. Then, from the far end of the path, a figure approached. A young officer, fresh uniform, badge still clean, walked slow but with purpose. He wasn't part of a patrol. No hand rested near his belt. His posture was open, alert, but not ready for violence, ready for presence. As he passed the Bronco, his eyes met Harrison's. He stopped. He didn't speak. He didn't gesture. He just stood still. And then, with a quiet that echoed louder than applause, he straightened fully and gave a long, respectful nod. Not a salute, not an order, just recognition. Harrison nodded back, not with a smile, just a single, deliberate movement. A man acknowledging another man, learning what mattered. The young officer moved on, and in that simple moment, something small, something permanent shifted in the quiet again. Back at the police academy, changes had already begun. New recruits were now required to watch the footage, not for fear, but for understanding. A mandatory module on situational restraint had launched under a temporary title. Most called it the Ford Protocol. But Harrison had asked they call it anything else. Still, something remained. In the west hallway of the Academy's training wing, beneath a wall of framed service photos, a bronze plaque had been mounted. No names, no logos. Just a single line, "Don't aim until you've learned what not to fear." Unknown. They all knew who said it, but no one needed to write it down. It wasn't about a name anymore. It was about what silence can teach when the world forgets to listen. And in that park, as the sun dropped slowly behind the trees, Harrison Ford sat in his old Bronco, tea cooling at his side, peace finally settling in, not as a reward, but as a confirmation. Sometimes change doesn't announce itself. It walks quietly and nods. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.